I'm Susan Morton. I'm the Director of the Growing Up in New Zealand study and Director of the Centre for Longitudinal Research at the University of Auckland. And it's really a great pleasure to be able to have a workshop up here looking at the data sets that are available for users to access and to ask questions of from the Growing Up in New Zealand resource. And we're really excited to be able to present it to you today. We presented this in Wellington a little while ago, and it's lovely to be able to present it in our home environment, really, our own university. So it's great to have a group of people who are interested in this, and please use this as a session to actually ask questions, to find out about the data sets, to find out about how you access them and so on. So there's going to be a few of us from the team presenting today, so I'm just going to start off with the context of where we're at, just giving you a bit of an overview. Some of you who are here this morning will see a little bit of overlap, but hopefully not too much, just really putting things in context, because until we talk about the data sets without doing that, it's kind of difficult to know what we're talking about. So just a few introductory slides to give you a sense of the sort of information that we have available at this point in time from the preschool period for these children. I'm going to hand over to Avanesh, who is going to take you through the process that we utilise to make data sets available and tell you a little bit about the data sets and the technicalities of those. Then we're going to move to Caroline, who is going to take you through some real life examples of interacting with the data sets and talk to you about some ways that she has used them, and hopefully that will set off some interactive conversation and some questions in your mind that we can then spend some time on. And then we're going to come to Peter Tricker, who's going to talk about how you access the data, talk about the e-research platform that is now set up to enable a safe and secure way to access that data, and just take you through some of the processes that are required to enable safe access and to protect the guardianship of the data, which is what we primarily are looking to do, that we always want to keep the anonymity of our participants paramount in the processes that we use, but at the same time make this rich resource available. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We've allowed a couple of hours, I think. I'm not sure that we're going to talk for that long, so I do hope that you ask some questions, make the best use of having the team here. There are others on the team who are also available. Our General Manager Annette is here, as is Sarah Berry, and our comms manager is here, so we've got other people who can also answer your questions. I'd like to point out Lana, but she told me I wasn't allowed to, but I just have. So there you go. Welcome, Lana. All right, so I'm just going to start, as I said, with just a little bit of an overview of the study, because I think really it will just provide the context of the data. Data is fantastic. It's important when you're using any data set to understand where it's come from. So that's my job, is to give you a bit of a background of where these data sets have come from this Growing Up in New Zealand cohort. And then we'll go on to the others in the team who will take you through some of the more technical details. So just a bit of a reminder, this goes back a long way now to 2004. The primary reason for setting up this new longitudinal study was to actually understand what was shaping the development of our children growing up in 21st century New Zealand, and to do so in a way that was scientifically robust, but which also could provide evidence to inform policy. And policy across sectors, recognising that children don't develop in silos, even though the way that ministries are often funded is more siloed. We wanted to understand how things operated across different domains and across different sectors. So basically this was a process that started in about 2004. It started with a request for proposals that was made through 16 government agencies in partnership with HRC. It was led in the first instance by the Ministry of Social Development, and they got together and actually put out a bid to say, can we have a team of people who can put forward a proposed design for what a new longitudinal study should look like? So that's really where this all began, which is a very long time ago now. Well, it seems not so long ago, but it was a long time ago. Why did we need a new longitudinal study? And that's a really good question. We've got a couple of perfectly good older ones that are still continuing to provide information. Well, we needed it for two major reasons. The first is that our population has changed dramatically since the 1970s. So we needed a study of children that was going to look at the diversity of our current population, our current birth population. So we wanted a study that could look at not just our New Zealand European children, but our Māori, our Pacific and our Asian children, as well as other ethnic groups. So the reason for starting this and for starting it with nearly 7,000 children is so that we had the statistical power to look at the outcomes for those children across those diverse groups, as well as across the diversity of ethnicity. Sorry, not ethnicity, socioeconomic status, because we wanted to actually understand what was happening right across the population. So important to remember, I think, when you're thinking about research questions, as well as utilising this data, this is a population study. It is a study that is designed to understand what's happening right across a population, from one end, extreme end, whether that's about deprivation or poverty or whatever other characteristic, some sort of health characteristic, right up to the opposite end of the spectrum and everything in between. So that is what this study is designed to collect, and that's what the children are on board to tell us about. So those are the sorts of research questions that you can be addressing with this study. The second component of why we needed a new longitudinal study is because the environment has changed dramatically since the 1970s. And that's actually true of New Zealand, but it's also true globally. So we wanted to actually make sure that, as well as looking at the children and focusing on them, that's another important part when you're looking at research questions with this study. This is a child-focused study. The children are generalisable to our population of births. The parents are not generalisable to all parents, right? They are the parents of a particular cohort of births. So we'll come back to that, but it's the children who are at the centre of this. So we wanted to also understand how, for example, parents had changed and the structure of families had changed over the generations. We wanted to understand the impact of new technology, which is sort of what this cartoon is demonstrating. The idea that children being born today are digital natives. So they're interacting in different ways, they're interacting different socially and so on. So we wanted to capture all those things. So both the population and the environment are key features that had changed that really precipitated the need for us to be setting up this new study to look at what was shaping development today and how we could then use the information we could get from these families to feed back to policymakers to say, this is what it's like out there, and this information is there to help you design policy that is relevant for our children and families of today and in New Zealand, not necessarily growing up in the UK or US or Australia or anywhere else. We had a conceptual framework that has sat behind the study right from the beginning, right from the development phase, so basically back to 2005, 2006 when the study was being designed. And this is important to actually take into account as well when you're thinking about research questions that are relevant for using this information. So this is a study that is very much a life course study, a life course epidemiological framework sits behind this study. You can see in the, well, you may not be able to see because it's quite small, but let me take you through it. The children sit at the centre of these concentric ovals or rings, and they are the focus of what we're looking at. We're following their development pre-birth all the way through to adulthood, and currently they're in early childhood. So the children are at the centre, and as part of that is their sort of biology and their innate characteristics, as well as what's happening to them on a day-to-day basis. But then we're also really interested in the environments that are around them. So the concentric set of circles or layers of the onion, if you like, that sit around the middle focus of the children. So we're interested in their family and their family structure and who's in their household and what's the nature of the relationships and how are they related to the child, always back to the child. And then the communities and environments and neighbourhoods that those children live in, and then the informal society that they interact with, and the formal society like education and health system. And then on the outside, we're interested in understanding all of these aspects of children's development in the context of the current political environment. So what are the policies that are in existence when we go and see these families? How are they reaching the families? What do we find out by looking at who's actually receiving the policy that they are intended to receive, who's missing out, and so on, so that we can then also shape policy in reverse. So basically we demonstrate this as two overlapping or concentric rings because we're interested not just in a snapshot, it's not just a cross-sectional study, it's a longitudinal study, so we're measuring those aspects every time we go and see the children and families. Or we're measuring them enough so that we can understand the change over time. And we're also interested in the dynamic interaction of that child with those environments, not just a passive recipient of what's going on around them, which is the arrows that sit between those circles and right across. So you can see down the right-hand side of that conceptual framework the sort of things that we're able to look at. So it is multidisciplinary. We look at lots of aspects of child development. I'll show you that in a minute. We absolutely are interested in change over time. And that's also important when you're thinking about the data sets, because we don't just go out and ask the same questions every time we see the family and children. We always plan the data collection wave to be age specific for the child, and importantly for the external environments to measure those when they have changed enough at a population level. So we don't ask the same questions necessarily about the family context every time we engage with the families and children, because at a population level they may not have changed. Or if they have, then we do want to know that rate of change. So understanding trajectories comes from that idea of measuring those things over time. We're absolutely interested not just in the children as isolated entities, if you like, but they are a product of transgenerational or cross-generational influences as well, so understanding where the parents and families have come from. Very much understanding not just the things that are proximal to the children, but also the more distal, and thinking about the temporal dimension in all of the analyses that we do. And really mixing up this idea of biology and society. So understanding the biological development of the children, but also understanding the social and seeing those as interconnected at every level. And we do also have some ways of looking at how the environment is modifiable and how that modifies biology. So that's part of what we do as well. So that's important to remember, I think, when you're thinking, what can I ask of this data set? And just to reiterate very briefly who's in the cohort, and I've told you most of this, we've got nearly 7,000 children. Mums were recruited in pregnancy. Dads were invited in pregnancy too. That's quite unusual in a cohort study, but it's been really important. Not all mothers had partners, so if you're looking at that data set, remember that some of the mums will not have a partner. Then we have the children, but we only knew about the size of that cohort after those children were born. So we recruited in pregnancy, we didn't actually know the full cohort size until after birth. So the actual denominator, if you're looking at children, is 6,853. But if you're looking at the mums or the dads, it's different. Also, just to confuse everybody or to make you think, those mums and dads can change. The children stay constant. Okay, so if the child moves or is adopted or moves into a fungi relationship, a fungi arrangement, or actually shifts home for whatever reason, the child will stay the centre of the study, but the caregivers may change. And they're not all male and female either in terms of gender roles. So those are some of the things to just be aware of when you're looking at the data set. But the children should always be there, so that's a good thing. You can always link on the children. We have, importantly, because of needing to capture the diversity of the cohort, these diversities of ethnic identity for the children. Initially, according to what mums and dads said their children were likely to identify with. So the 1 in 4 Māori, the 1 in 5 Pacific, the 1 in 6 Asian, they come from mums' idea of what their children were going to be before that child was born. Dads, we have different numbers and they don't always agree. And now that the children are getting older, they can tell us themselves. So ethnicity changes. So you can't just put someone in a group and assume that's where they'll stay forever. It is one of the things that will change along with all of those other factors. But importantly, we have, with the sample size, enough statistical power to look within those groups as well as at the population as a whole. So that's really important. Multiple ethnicities is becoming much more common as the children get older. So that's something to be aware of as well. Almost 1 in 2 by 4.5 identify with 2 or more ethnic groups. So if you're trying to divide people into one group only, that creates a few issues that you need to think through. There are ways to do it, but it's important to consider how you're doing that and what that means when you're then looking at your outcomes. We've demonstrated that the cohort is broadly generalisable to contemporary New Zealand births. There's a paper if you want to go back to that, and I do suggest you do. There's also a technical calibration document on our website which talks all about the population of interest and how we recruited this cohort in order to match that and how it aligns. That's important when you're thinking about the generalisability of results you may get from analyses that you run. Retention rates have been high, which is great when you're thinking about using the data. We've maintained contact actually with about 97% of the families. We know where they are. In terms of completion of data collection waves, they're over 90% of baseline at every data collection wave, but it's not always the same 90%. We have skips that are possible where some families and children can move in and out. So they may take part, for example, in the 9-month, miss the 2-year and then be back in again at 4.5. So again, when you're using the information, the denominators are not subsets of each other's. Yes, I know that causes problems, Avanish, but it's something to be aware of. Again, your children are the ones that you want to look at in that regard, but just be aware that while the retention rates are high, so you've got a good rate of children who have been in all the data collection waves, it's not always the same children. So you need to think about that, and we are gradually putting out more and more technical documentation to help you with that, which you may be grateful for. Just a bit of a note about the sort of things that you're going to hear about today, the sort of data we've collected so far that will be available to you to apply for either externally or to work in partnership with the team on. We had mums and dads who were interviewed in the late pregnancy of these children. So we have information from both of them from face-to-face interviews in the home. Those were conducted where possible independently. Occasionally if people didn't want to be on their own, then we have a note about where they were, but in most cases that was collected independently, and you'll find quite a lot of repeated information that we asked mums and dads, even some of the things that we normally wouldn't ask dads. Things like, you know, whether they changed their diet in pregnancy, things about their depression score, things about paternal drinking and so on. So you can look at those and look at those in conjunction with mum once you link them up according to the right ID, which you're going to get taken through later on. We then had several contacts with the families in the postnatal period, because obviously recruiting in pregnancy had some challenges, had some risks as well, because not all pregnancies ended in a successful outcome. So we had to be very sensitive at the 6-week phone call, which you'll see there represented by an old style phone. I don't think anything looks like that anymore, but we might need to change that graphic. But at 6 weeks we made contact, 6 weeks post the expected date of delivery, because remember at that stage we didn't necessarily know when the children had been born. So some of them had been born quite early, a few had been born late, but most had been born by then, which is good. And that's at the point where we could actually say who was in the cohort. And some of them are multips, they're not all singletons. We have about 3% of the cohort who are twins or triplets. Again, you need to think about that if you're thinking about clustering of information. And clustering of information from parents who may be the same parent of 2 or 3 different children. So important to look at that as well. Then the next big data collection wave that we have and that's available to you is when the children were 9 months of age. We always, for our face-to-face data collection waves, certainly always to date, have preceded those with a phone call to the families to find out where they are, number one, because if you heard this morning, they keep moving, which is very troublesome when you're trying to find these people, but they do, and that's fine. So we recognised that early, so we needed to know where they were and also to plan the interview. We also do things like household grid at that stage, who's in the home, what's their relationship to the child and so on. Who are we going to interview, which is always an important question because mum and dad might have changed, and at this stage we're still interviewing primarily mum and her partner or dad of the child. And then the next data collection wave is at 2. You can see that in between that there were also some other phone calls to find out where these people were, to collect a little bit of information, but generally those phone call information or the pieces of information from the phone calls are integrated into the big data collection wave. So you'll see them as the 2-year data collection wave, and it will include some of the information that was collected in between. And then the most recent data collection wave is actually a bit of a mix of 3 different contacts, and they were slightly different contacts than the previous ones. So we had quite a large audit call at 31 and 45 months that was really designed to find out about ECE use as well as some other characteristics about where the children were at. And then the big face-to-face interview that we had next was at 4.5. So that's the sort of mix of data sets that we're going to be talking about today, that you're able to access to answer questions in the preschool period about these children developing from pre-birth through to just before they're ready to start school. We do link to data sets as well, routine data sets, or the data sets that now are in the IDI. The IDI wasn't around when we started. and gradually we're increasing the linkage to those, and some of those derived variables, once we get those linked in, are also made available externally so that you can utilise some of that information as well from health information largely at this stage, but increasingly from education as well. So that takes a little bit of work. We do measure the children. Those measurements are available at 2 and at 4.5, so you can look at their anthropometry. And we also measure things like parent-child interaction. So there are various tools that you can look at to tell you about the nature of the relationship of the children, as well as looking at aspects of their cognition and other sort of aspects of their development. So those things are all in the data set. And just very briefly, while the data sets are longitudinal, and sorry, go on.
Sorry, just on that previous slide,
Yep.
there was no interviews of fathers.
No, there wasn't. Well, that's a very good point. Very astute of you to notice that. So at 4.5, we didn't have enough resource to see the dads separately. That said, though, we went out and found some additional funding from another agency and have subsequently interacted with the dads. So, but it's not part of this data set yet because it happened later. So we hope we can integrate that and keep catching up with the dads going forward. But at 4.5, we only had enough resource to actually engage with the mums and the children. So that's where we're at this stage. Eventually, hope to include the dads too. Okay, so every time we go out, these are the sorts of pieces of information we want to find out about. We don't necessarily ask about them in the same depth or detail every time, but this is what we are looking to track longitudinally. We're interested in the family and who's in the family and how the structure of the household is changing around the child. As I said before, we're interested in these other aspects of neighbourhood, community, societal interaction and engagement in society for these families and children. And obviously at age-appropriate ways, so thinking about that over time. A lot of information in the first 5 years data set is about education. So it starts with aspirations of the parents in terms of their children's expectations of how far these children will go in education, as well as things like whether they think they will return to work and use childcare or ECE. So we have measurements of that sort of interaction over those first 5 years as well, and then we actually start to get to points where we're thinking about expectations of parents for their children as they go into school. So we're now at the point where children are transitioning into the school environment, and that's where the data collection is at right now. There's a lot of information about the children's health and well-being in that preschool period, and we try and take a holistic view of that. So we're trying to look not just at disease or at things that create poor health, but actually what creates well-being. So a lot of information there to try and help us with that. Alongside that, we're interested in cognitive development and measuring that over time. We're interested in behaviour, we're interested in relationships. So all of those sorts of standard tools you'll see being used by us. And where we can, we use validated standard tools and we reference those so you can see them in the data user guide, so you can see what's been utilised. Occasionally we've had to adapt those for the New Zealand context, so we've also described those and you'll hear about where you can find that information, but just have a look and look carefully at what those look like. And also be aware that some scales are meant to be used as scales and not individual items, although often we'll provide you with the individual items in the external data set so you can look at the distribution of information yourself. And this really important one at the end, the ethnicity, culture and identity domain, which is not fixed, as I said at the beginning, so just being aware of how that can change over time and how mums and dads can disagree about what their children think they are as well. And I'm sure the children will disagree with their mums and dads when we talk to them when they're 8 themselves. So that's going to get more complicated, not less, but interesting, I think. Just to show you that it may seem like quite a strange science when you see the data sets and you see the questionnaires and you see the data user guides, all of which you're going to have to get to know, because actually it's about all of that mix of things as well as the data sets. It may seem quite weird in terms of how we've come to what we've come to, but there is a method and there is a flow chart and a process that we use to prioritise what we measure at each time point, what is appropriate, who we're getting a measurement from, and how often we need to repeat it. So this is just a flow chart to look at some of the ways that we assess that over time, because inevitably when we go to field and try and satisfy what 16 government agencies want, as well as about 16 different departments around the universities, because not just one, then you could be there all day, and obviously you can't be there all day in someone's home. You've got to make decisions about what is important and what stays in. So you may well find as well that when you go to the data set, there's something you wish we had done It's very likely we wish we'd done it as well, but you can always ask, and we can always do it later. One of the great advantages about longitudinal studies is you can go back, which is kind of nice, because if you've missed something, there's an opportunity to get it back later. Not always as accurately. We're always worried about recall bias. We want to ask prospectively if we can, but there is a methodology that we use. So if you're interested in that, you can absolutely have a look at how we design these tools and how we put them together, which takes a couple of years actually to design a data collection wave, particularly with all the consultation. So it's not just a pull this off the shelf and here we go. It takes a wee while, and we're always interested in people's views of what we should do next. So as you're using the data sets, if that's what you're going to be doing, please do feel that you can come to us and say, hey, have you thought about this particular aspect? And if it fits with the conceptual framework and fits the population level information, we can absolutely look at whether there's something we can include in a future data collection wave. So I think I've probably talked about some of this, the fact that the 16 government agencies that started with us have continued with us on this longitudinal journey. And we haven't just gone to policymakers with our outcomes. What we have collected from the families has very much been informed by the policy issues of the day and by thinking about how we can provide evidence and information that has utility at a policy level, but ultimately which is also scientifically robust. So those are the two things that drive what we do. So pretty much this interaction with the government agencies as well as stakeholders takes place at all levels of this project. So when you see some of the things potentially in the questionnaires and you're not sure where those come from, sometimes they will be things that are really important to a particular government agency, and we've decided they fit very well with what we need to ask as well. So it is constantly saying, how do we provide evidence about these families and these children's lives that can actually make change and inform policy and do things differently than we're currently doing them, recognising that some of our statistics are not that great for our children in New Zealand, and they probably should be. So the other thing to be aware of is it is possible to use these data sets to look at risk factors, and that's quite often the way that you will start using these data sets. But just be aware that we're trying to get beneath that. We're trying to ask why. That's the value of this sort of data from families and children. We can look at risk factors, but importantly, we can also look at why people move in and out of risky situations, or what changes the environment for them, or who is moving in and out of a certain health condition, for example, or behavioural situation, and why. So these are the sorts of questions that really drive the collection of the information. We're asking why, we're asking what works, which is really important to have that population perspective, so both ends of the spectrum as well as in the middle. And these are the sorts of questions that actually this sort of data can address best. So just keep that in mind, that that's what we're hoping for, and obviously that's evolving over time. So let's get to why we're here today, which is to talk about the wonderful data that we have in the preschool period from these families, nearly 7,000 of them, and their mums and their dads, and get into the nitty-gritty of what we have for hopefully people like you who would like to engage and use this resource to answer some of your questions as well. Here's just a bit of an overview of where we've got to with retention. I said we were over 90% in data collection waves. If you go to the report that is out on Now We Are 4 and our website, you'll see the details of that. So here's a breakdown of that idea about who skipped these data collection waves, why people have opted out. You see the absolute opt-outs are quite small. We have had some deaths, obviously, which is very sad, not enough to look at as a group probably yet in terms of power, but nevertheless that's something to be aware of. So just noting who's in, who's out and why is part of this journey. And the sort of data sets down the side are the ones that you're going to be introduced to today. And the sort of data that we've collected at 4 years and actually up to 4 years is represented in this sort of word picture. So there's a huge amount of data here that has come from these families and the children over this period of 5 years. So really there's a wealth of opportunity here to ask a lot of research questions. But those research questions should be in the context of a population level study. So while there are lots of things we can do, we quite often say that where there are rare conditions that are less than 5% of a population of children or families, it's not the best study to ask questions. So we really are looking at things that have a prevalence rate of 5% or greater in general. Okay, so just something to keep in mind. All right, so I'm going to hand over to Avanish, who's going to take you through some of the more technical details about the data sets, and then we'll... Any questions from the beginning? Just, you stay there, that's right. Were you all good? Okay. Thanks, Avanish.
Perfect. No, thanks, Susan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Avanish Pillay. I'm the Data Analytics Manager for Growing Up in New Zealand, and I'm a statistician. So hopefully that's got your attention. But thank you, Susan. So the next few slides, I don't have many of them, but the next few slides I'm hoping to show you. So we've all heard about how much data there is, right? We've all heard about how many different things we've asked our children, our mothers, our partners about, and so we've got a ton of information. So I'm just going to give you a few slides, and I'm hoping to give you an idea of how many data sets we have, how much information there is visually, how to use them, how to merge these data sets together across time, or to look at things in isolation, and the resources you're going to need to do this, because I look at this pretty much every day and I still get confused. So let's have a look. Oh, goodness. Okay. So I thought I'd start with this slide. This is just to give you an idea of the process with which we end up with our anonymized data sets at the end, right? So our interviewers go out, they collect all this information, and through phone calls. It all comes in there, it's collated, our data manager cleans it, audits it, and gives us a nice clean data set. The stats team then prepares this for our internal researchers, accredited researchers, and so at this stage here, this information is still not anonymized, right? So it has identifying information in it. And so one of the underlying principles of the study is the guardianship of the data, right? So if you were to use it, we have to honor that agreement, and we have to anonymize these data sets so that any identifying information, which then can be used to identify children, families, partners, mothers, is removed, okay? So when I say removed, I don't mean any data is removed. What I mean is any identifying information is removed, right? And so we go through this step here, we clean the data, we create some derived variables, we merge it all back in. We then give you some formats and label assignments so that everything makes sense in there and labels are not cryptic. We then order these variables because for our current data release, we've got data sets that have over 550 variables in them. And so we give them some sort of order according to the questionnaire. And then we create a final data set, and that's our anonymized data set. This then gets prepared in many different formats. So SAS, R, SPSS, Stata, and then we store it securely and give it to our information systems manager, who will then load it onto a platform, which Peter will talk about, which then you can access. Okay. So I've got this slide here, and this is just to help you with thinking about how the information is collected, right? So we interviewers collect information from mothers, right? From partners. Then we collect children information provided by their mother. Okay. We also collect children's information provided by their partners, mother's partners. And then we have child observation data, right? So this is information about the child collected by the interviewer. Things such as anthropometric measurements, scales and tools. So these are the 5 sort of domains of data that we have. Okay. And got this slide in here as well, thank you, Caroline. So we also have some linkage data that we've linked to the interviewer data and telephone data that we've collected, right? So we've got some data from our immunization register, things like hospitalization and admission from our national minimum data sets. We've got information on scales and tools, so things like the SDQ questionnaire. And then we have child observation data. Okay, so all this is linked in, and LinkedIn, and then this picture is just meant to give you a visual of what we have. So if you were to think of data sets, keep this in mind. So Caroline will go through an example after me of a research question, which then uses data from here, and then hopefully there's an answer to it. But if you visualize it this way, I find it really helps, right? So you can see up the top there, we've got our data collection waves. Okay, so we've got data collection wave 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then in data collection wave 0, you've got those cylinders, which then says you've collected mother and partner data. Yeah? And if you go through, this is the focus of our data release. 3, 4, 5, so 3 and 4 were telephone interviews, and 5 was the really big interview questionnaires that was done. And so you can see we've got mother and then child mother information. Same at DCW4 and then at DCW5 as well. And so if you just keep this in mind, if possible, it really helps. Any questions so far? Yeah.
In your previous slide, you're talking about linkages.
Mm-hmm.
You can link to your immunisation register, the NMDS.
Yep.
Are you able to go back and do bespoke linkages? So you were talking about respiratory hospitalisation admission from the NMDS.
Yes.
What if I wanted to go back to the NMDS and find broken bones or traumatic brain injury?
Yes, so we have that information. Now there's a reason and rationale for the things we have linked, but we have a whole lot more that we haven't linked and is there, so there is certainly the potential for that.
And what about other databases that are in the IDI, for example, that you haven't used here? So just got to my head, like justice. Let's say you want to go back and find out if there's a parental relationship for convictions in the justice system.
So we can only link to parental consent. So let's just be clear about that for a start. So everything we're able to link to needs the consent of the parents at the moment on behalf of their children. We also need child assent at 8 years, and we'll increasingly need children's own consent for linkage. So at the moment, the linkage that we have permission for from most parents, not all, is for linkage to health and education data. So that includes all of the things that you've been talking about, anything in the NMDS, anything in the pharma records, anything in the perinatal records, and the educational, the ECE and formal school records. If we wanted to go back and link to some other data sets, which we potentially would like to do in the future, we need to get consent from the parents for that before we do it, before we do it internally and before we provide that externally as derived variables, which is what this is about. So that linkage takes a while. It takes a while to clean it and integrate it, and then we have to go through an even more detailed process actually alongside to release that linked data in a way that is still safe for the parents externally. So at the moment we can't just link to the whole IDI.
Yep.
No.
It's more complicated than that because of our consent and
But consent, subject to consent, technically you can link to anything in the IDI. It's expensive, it's difficult.
Yeah, we can, but we absolutely need parental agreement with that. So anything, we've looked at that, so absolutely, But at the moment, we just haven't explored all of that because it's about trust, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And
sorry about that.
No, thanks. Thank you for that. As well, while the concept of linking is always easy to imagine, there's a whole lot of admin that goes on behind the scenes, and I know for a fact the IDI data, the way that it's stored and de-identified is well, there'll be a lot of work to link all this up, but yes.
So from now on, will there be links between what the child reports and what the mother or partner reports, because that might show some differences?
Yes, so I'll get to that. Yep. So exactly, yep. So that's probably a very obvious question to everyone. Just before I get on to that, this is the way this is a naming convention that we've adopted for our data sets and all the variables in it, right? So it's very sensible, I think. We've got the data collection wave. That probably came out wrong. We've got the data collection wave. It tells you what data set it's from. It gives you the short name for the data set, and I find that very handy as a reference. Then the thing that I always focus on is the variable suffix. So when you look at these data sets, every variable will have a suffix, and that should identify which data set it's come from. And so that's how you identify if it's a 54-month mother data set or if it's a 2-year mother data set. Now, one thing I should mention is these slides that I'm showing you, these are all part of our data user guide document, which is on our website for the external data release. So I highly recommend that the first thing you all do is go to the website, find that document, external data release 4, and have a look through it, because that answers a lot of potential questions I think that you have. Okay. So I've put this slide up here, and this is to maybe answer part of your question. So we've got all these different data sets, right? And we've got all these different variables. We've got mother ID at antenatal, we've got mother ID at 6 weeks, at 9 months. So how do we link all this together? Right? So as Susan mentioned, the common theme through all of these data sets is the child. Okay? So the child ID is the one thing that doesn't change through all these data sets. Okay? You might find a child present here, but not here, and then present here again. But that ID does not change. Now, the child's caregiver, the mother, might change. Yeah, so the partner might change, the mother's partner, but the child is the common link through all these data sets. So when you're merging these data sets, if you're taking a 2-year data set and a 54-month data set and you're merging them together, do it on the child ID first, and then check what you've gotten, because often you'll find that the merge that you get at the end might not be the one you want. Okay, so you just have to be really careful with that. And then just a few comments that I have. So this is longitudinal data. There is a lot of it at different time points. There are 13 data sets in total at the moment for the external data release. So once you've all applied and have access and have logged on, you'll see 13 of them. Then Caroline will focus on this more, but it's really which time point are you interested in? If you're interested in more than one, what is the focus? Are you hoping to answer mother-related questions? Are you hoping to answer child observation questions? Are you hoping to answer questions about children? So depending on what your question is, that'll dictate how you do your merge and the data set you end up with. Merging data sets is very important. Always check if you have the correct denominator. We've recently experienced that, Caroline, combining all these data sets together. One thing I'm stressing is, so it's very tempting, right? So looking at this data set here, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to go in and I'm going to grab all 13 data sets and I'm going to make one huge data set which has everything in there, right? From antenatal, perinatal, all the way through to 54-month. I'm tempted to do that myself, but if you do that, and it's a child-focused data set, you're going to end up with 6,853 rows of data, and you're going to end up with about 10,000 columns of variables. And so it's actually very cumbersome to analyze data like that. Instead, focus on the questions you're interested in, narrow it down to those questions, extract those from your data set, and merge them together. On the website, all the data collection wave questionnaires are present as well, so please have a look. Some other things to focus on is missing data across time points. For whatever reason, there is missing data present. People don't answer, people don't know. You'll definitely get different denominators there. And be aware of things such as 98 and 99, especially when you're doing summaries, which I think is the first thing most people will do. I mean, I've done this myself. I've done a summary and I've gone, oh, why is this such a big number? But it's because it's counted 98 and 99 in there, right? So you just have to look at your data before you do these things. Just remember that this is individual data. It's not aggregated data. And so, again, the denominator matters. You have to be very careful about, well, I suppose Peter will talk about this, data storage concerns. Might not be such an issue, but software considerations is. So we've made these data sets available in SAS, in SPSS, in Stata. I might have mentioned R before, but actually we don't We don't have R data sets for this, but it's very easy to convert those data sets. Now, I personally use SAS and R to do all my data imports, manipulations. So just be careful which software package you use. Some are much easier to use with really big amounts of data. And be aware that identification keys provide the relationships between the data sets. So all the external data sets have a 7-digit alphanumeric key, right? A child ID, mother ID, partner ID, and a family ID. And then it just depends what you're wanting to do with it and what your research question is. Are you hoping to merge child to child across time, child to mother or partner, or mother and partner? So there are many ways you can slice and dice these 13 data sets. Just depends on the question of interest. Peter will focus more on this, but I think I've mentioned this before. The external data release 2017 document, crucial reading. Make sure you please have a look at least at the table of contents. Most of the questions you have should be answered in there. Look at the data collection wave, the questionnaire itself, and then the data dictionaries are also present there. The data dictionaries are actually very useful because they actually give you, well, these are the columns in it. And I find that very useful because a lot of the times I look at the data sets, I have no idea what the variable is. I sort of remember it. I flick over to the data dictionary, scroll down, I type in the variable name, and I find it here. And it tells me what the labels are. And the most important thing in the data dictionary is the notes column. So the notes column tells you whether it's derived or not, whether we've reclassified them, whether we've collapsed the categories, gives you a really good idea of what's happening with the variable you're interested in. We'll be around after this for any questions you have, or you can ask questions now if you prefer, but I'll hand over to Caroline. Okay.
Alrighty, kia ora everybody. So I've been asked to give a researcher's perspective, or things I wish I knew before I started. So I've been with the study for about 1.5 years, and one of the first projects I was involved was a study looking at gambling participation and child health outcomes that we did for the Ministry of Health. So I'm going to use this as a bit of an example. I'm not going to share results or anything crazy like that, so don't get too excited. But I'll just give you some tips about how the things that I needed to know to use the data. So first things first, what is your research question? The data is so vast. There's so many questions in it. So I guarantee that most people could find their research question is answerable with our data set. It's an incredible resource. So in this example, we were looking at parental gambling in the first 9 months of life and how that was associated with child health at 2 and 4 years of age. So we asked parents about gambling at 9 months, both the mother and the partner. So the sources of data that I need, so if we think back to Avanesh's slides, were both mother and partner data at the 9-month period, but we also need the antenatal period, and that's because we need to get covariates that aren't asked at every time point. So although gambling was asked at 9 months, we didn't ask about parental education or an age variable, so I get those variables from the antenatal data set. Other data sets that I needed to use for this piece of work are the child proxy data set. So this was the parent report of child health outcomes, for example. We also use scales, so the strengths and difficulty scale, to look at child behaviour. So again, understanding where that scale comes from, I would highly recommend you read through the data user guide, as well as the other tools, literature that we have. And these include both the questionnaire and the data dictionary. I don't think you should just use one. Always use them together. They don't kind of work on their own. You kind of need the whole picture. So for example, not everyone answers every question. So if somebody doesn't work, for example, we're not going to ask them subsequent questions about their work. So just bear those kinds of things in mind when you're looking at denominators. So the other source of data that we had for this piece of work was linkage data. So we used hospital admission data and the immunisation register data. And so again, when trying to understand how we generated this data, go back to your data dictionaries, to your data user guides, or if all else fails, just ask for help. Oopsie. Okay, so the first step, you've got your research question, you've found all your variables you want, you've identified the data sets that they come from, and I should say, you will have some variables that it will exist in multiple data sets. So you've got to decide what is the most appropriate data set for your research question. So for this particular piece of work, I wanted all my variables to be from the 9-month data set. I had to get some variables like age from the antenatal data set, but I wasn't too concerned about that kind of variable, as it shouldn't change, should it? Well, it does, unfortunately, but it's all relative. So the other really important thing to think about when you're looking at data variables is this a single response or a multi-response option? So using gambling as an example, we did it's a single response option, and that you say, I participated in buying a lotto ticket in the last 12 months, yes or no. But if we take that a step further, we asked about multiple types of gambling. And so the gambling variables are actually made up of a whole bunch of variables, and I had to derive that variable myself so that I had a yes, no, had this person gambled at any for any reason, at any type of gambling, from lotto to horse racing to Keno. And over 50% of all you have gambled, just in case you wanted to know. It's most likely the national statistics, and true in growing up as well. The other one is coding. So in this case, gambling was coded 0, no gambling, 1, gambling. However, never assume. Never assume. Always go back to your data dictionary and look at how things were coded. So for example, if you've got numeric coding from 1, 2, 3, and 4, if that's truly a numeric scale, and as Avinash pointed out, it also included an option to say, I don't know, there'll be a 99 in there. So if you add those together, you're going to get some inflated scores. So just really get to know the data, and also look at distributions as well. That'll always give you a hint if your distribution doesn't look quite right, that you may have something going on with a 98 or a 99. I'm just getting back to the merging of the data sets. I always merge on child ID. It is your most robust option because families change and your primary caregiver can change, and you know, children move in and out of different families. So the way that I approach this is I merge on child ID, and then I say, okay, compare mothers across time. So compare mother IDs across time, and are they always the same or do they change? And if it's important to my research question that it's always the mother reporting throughout, then I would exclude those that change. So I would just create a logical rule, for example, to say true if it never changes and false if it does change, and I'll subset my data based on that variable. Also, Susan and Avinash also mentioned the multiples. So we have twins in our study. If you're doing a study where, for example, in gambling, I'm looking at parental gambling on the effect of child health outcomes. In this instance, I decided that I was only interested in one child from each family. I didn't want two children contributing to my total data set. So in that case, I subsetted my data based on birth order, so only took firstborn. So if you're a singleton, you're always the firstborn, and if you're a multiple, I only took the firstborn. So I find that's quite an easy approach to overcoming that little hurdle. So other derived variables that we have, and again, these are all explained in your data dictionaries and in your user guides. Things like ethnicity. So I hadn't worked with ethnicity before I started with the study, so I found that a bit confusing. So you have externally prioritized ethnicity and self-prioritized ethnicity. So when thinking about ethnicity, obviously come back to your research question, but just understanding how they were derived. So for example, with externally derived, it would be derived on a hierarchy, whereas if you So when you ask the question, you know, what ethnic identity or what ethnic group do you belong to, you can choose multiple ethnicities. And so it's important to understand what we then did with that data in terms of externally prioritising that data and creating a derived variable. The other type of ethnicity variable we have is self-prioritisation. So that's where the participant actually says, I identify with these 5 ethnicities, but this is my main ethnicity, or these are my 2 main ethnicities, for example. Scales would be the other one. So Susan mentioned that scales, we always try and use validated scales, of course, but sometimes they're not appropriate for our children or for New Zealand children. And this is a bit of a random example, but I quite like it as one to demonstrate. There's a task we have called the hand clap test. It's probably not called the hand clap test, is it? Yeah, is it? Yeah, anyway. And so traditionally in other literature, what's been done with this test is the interviewer would tap a pen, so this will do. And the child would have to tap the same thing back to them. In our case, we use clapping. And the child would. You guys are terrible. Pete, you get first prize. So those are just little, I mean, it is not a big thing. Obviously, it's still measuring the same type of response, but in some instances, it may just change how you interpret the data. And so we have all those references in the data dictionaries, as well as in the data user guide. Again, if you have any questions, always ask. But as Susan mentioned, a lot of thought goes into creating these scales or using these scales. So there is a lot of documentation around why they've been used. And I was going to talk about linkage again. Can't quite remember why. So again, just with linkage, sorry, it's not very professional. So yeah, respiratory illness admitted to hospital is the linked data that I've used in this case. So again, if you wanted to know what that actually means in real terms, how was that derived, you would go back to your
User guide.
data user guide. Yes, correct, Avinash. And that is it. And that is how you write a beautiful paper on a project. Any questions?
Could you write one for me?
Why is your so high?
So just on ethnicity and self-prioritise. So say someone, rather than prioritise one ethnicity and 2, said Māori Pacific, was there an internal prioritisation? Would Pacific would then become Māori?
I'll hand over to... Oh.
Yes, so for the 5% of families or parents who could not decide their main ethnicity and said we can only give you 2, then we give you that information, but we also then can apply a prioritisation to that. So you've got everybody's got one ethnic group, but again, choose the one that fits your research question best and understand that you've got that dynamic going on. So.
Right, so I'll hand over to Pete now, and he's going to describe how you actually get your hands on the data.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Peter Tricker. I'm the Information Systems Manager at Growing Up in New Zealand, so the IT geek, for want of a better word. I look after the data access process, so getting users onto the system, so that's what I'm going to concentrate on today. But firstly, I'm going to repeat one more time, just in case you don't know where our information is kept, on our website, growingup.co.nz. Big green button on the right-hand side, that is where we will find all of the information that Caroline and Avinash have referred to. So that's where we'll find our user guides. There's a user guide per data release, so there should be 3 of them on the website now. 3? 2? Okay. Data dictionary, we'll have a data dictionary per data set and a questionnaire per data set, and that's where we also find our data access forms and all of the information relating to the data access protocol. If you have any questions, that's our generic email address, dataaccess@growingup in New Zealand. It's a mailbox that's shared by several of us, so we always monitor that and we'll hopefully respond to your queries in a timely fashion. Accessing the data. How do I access this wonderful external data that we've been telling you about today? So we have you as the external researcher. From our point of view, you're out there in the cloud. You attend a workshop like this one. We had one in Wellington as well. That's right, we had one in Wellington as well for people based down there. We also film sorry, I'm a bit conscious of the camera now. We also film the workshop and we'll put an edited video up online as well. And people can also access the videos about the workshops in order to basically to help yourself, to inform yourself before you decide to make an application for our data. On the website you find all the forms, you fill one out, a data access application form, you send it off to that email address that I mentioned earlier, data access at GrowingUpInNewZealand, at growingup.co.nz. We have an internal data access process that we must adhere to. That process is outlined in the data access protocol, which you can also find on our website. Your application will go through this process. If you are successful, we will give you access to the remote data access platform. Remote data access platform. Okay, this is a new system for us. We've only had it online for about a year now. It works very similarly to the data lab that you'll find at StatsNZ, and there's a few other of these facilities around the country within the government. It's a self-contained system, so that means there's no clipboard access. You can't copy and paste onto your own machine. There's no print access, you can't print things out. There's no internet access, you can't access the internet. And there's no LAN access, you can't connect to your own company's network. It actually sounds quite terrible, doesn't it? And there's a very good reason for this, and that's to protect the privacy and the security of our participants. It also protects you. You've got a safe environment in which you can work. There is no danger of you accidentally releasing data out into the public space. So, for all parties involved, I think it's a big tick for honouring our data access protocols. Data access protocol. That's also you're screwing up your face. It's a lot of words, but it's very important. The data we're governed by our data access protocol at Growing Up in New Zealand. This determines our guardianship over the data that all of our Growing Up in New Zealand participants have provided to us. It outlines our governing principles. It describes the application process to access the external data. I highlighted that in red again. It's about safeguarding the privacy of our participants. That is paramount to us, and paramount to the participants, no doubt. The safeguarding of the privacy of our participants also ensures, or goes along to ensure the sustainability of the project. We also describe the role and the function of the Data Access Committee, who oversee the entire process, and we've also got details around authorship and publications should you get that far in your research and you wish to publish something out in the public space. Questions so far? That's excellent. Other ways to access the Growing Up in New Zealand data. We have touched on this a few times. You can also become an accredited researcher. So that's a facility that gives you the opportunity to come and work alongside us, alongside the Growing Up in New Zealand team, to leverage off our expertise. The information is also available on the website, and it has its own application form. It still goes through the data access process. We can also create a bespoke report for you. I think a couple of people have touched on that today, and also this morning we had some examples where we've produced bespoke output for IR, for example, is a very prominent case, and we're always happy to do that for you. So if you feel you're not up to doing the analysis yourself, come and talk to us. we'll see what we can do for you. Acknowledgements. Well, that's, sorry, I should say, if any more questions about that. No. Acknowledgements, you know, we couldn't do this without, you know, the children and the families in our study. They've been with us for many years. They're very loyal and engaged. We ask a lot of them and we thank them from the bottoms of our hearts. Of course, we've got a very keen and enthusiastic Growing Up team, some of whom are here today, and every day I think we thank them for all the work, all the hard work that they put into the study. And we recognise our lead agency, Suparu, of course, and the Ministry of Social Development, who have been with us since the beginning of the study. And also there's many other agencies who are involved, up to 16 I believe, who are involved in the Growing Up in New Zealand study. We have a policy forum who's very active with us, who advise and guide on our data collection waves. We also take advantage of advisory and stakeholder groups. We have a scientific advisory group, many stakeholder groups, and other funders. We do get funding not just from Super and the MSD, but we get it from other agencies as well, and we thank them as well. Thank you very much. Questions?
What about sort of when they're actually putting an application in, and just with the licence, is there an opportunity just to, can you just describe how they get that licence, you know, the UPI with the university, like sometimes or when?
Oh, that slightly complicated process of, okay, that's a very good question. So our remote data access platform relies on you being a University of Auckland member, or you have to register with the University of Auckland. The university has a system where anybody who's involved with the university in any way must register themselves on the website, and this process creates a username. With that username, we walk you through a sort of a two-step process to get you access not just to the university network in the first place to recognise you as a user on the system, but a secondary step to get you onto the remote data access platform. Once you're on, it usually works. Hello.
Could I just ask a question, and maybe someone else on the team answers it? And,
yes.
It's probably the elephant in the room, and that is there a cost to access this info?
No. To access the external data sets?
Yeah, well, yeah. It depends on whether you're an external or whether you're partnering, or there's no...
If you're external, there's no cost. If you're partnering with us, it depends on what you're doing. That's a slightly different pathway. So if you're working as an accredited researcher and you're requesting direct help from us, or you've requested that we produce some bespoke output for you, then there is likely to be a cost associated with that, but just to access the external data sets alone, no, there isn't. Welcome.
What are the requirements for doing an accredited research, and how long's the process?
Oh, I think, go on, Susan. It's a very good question, and we do get that asked a lot.
So an accredited researcher becomes an honorary member of the team. The first process is that you have a chat with the team, so usually that comes through me or one of the other senior researchers, so Sarah, who was here earlier, or there she is, wandering around the back. So there's a discussion, because an accredited researcher starts a partnership, if you like, so there's an agreement that we're going to work together. So the first part of the process is to come and have a chat and say, what can we do together and how can we utilise each other's expertise? Essentially, what's a win-win that we can get out of this process? Going back to the previous question, that may require a funding application as well if we don't have resources already available to do that joint project. Then once that's agreed, which may take one meeting, it may take a few discussions, usually it's not very long, we would then put an application in for data access, which is again in this case like the internal data access, but associated with that would also be an accredited researcher application, which is what you're asking. That requires a CV, so you tell us about your experience and your ability or capacity to utilise these sorts of data sets, basically to answer the research question that's going forward, depending on what your role is in that partnership. So it's a process that just is sort of a double up, if you like. It's the external, or it's the process of just filling in a form that says this is a research question I want to answer, but then as an accredited researcher, you're effectively becoming part of the team, so we want to know a bit more about you, so you fill in your CV as well. And then both of those documents go together to the Data Access Committee through the same sort of process that either internal ones do, because the internal team has to do that as well. They just don't need a CV because they've already been through that process. They're part of the team, but they have the same process through the Data Access Committee, or an external one which is completely separate from the team, where they would put an external data access application into. So there's sort of 3 processes that we can operate. Probably fair to say, actually, we've only ever turned down one data access application out of hundreds. That we really do try and enable people to utilise this data set. This is not a reason to say no. The only reason we said no in that case is because the research question just couldn't be addressed with this data set. We're prepared to work with people to sort of work through your research question to see what would actually apply, what would work. So we really are looking to make these data sets available. But the data access protocol and data access committee processes, all of which you'll find on the website under that green button, are very, very important, because as many of us have now said, that protection of anonymity and privacy of participants is what is paramount to us. And when you get access, which hopefully you will, and you go through all these processes that Peter's taken you through, you will be asked to sign a form that says you are going to honour that guardianship. So whatever researcher you are, internal, accredited or external, you will be required to sign a form to say, I will protect the guardianship of this data that will comply with the data access protocol. And that really does mean that you're going to, that's in some ways what Pete was saying, providing this safe environment for the data set, but also safe for you, actually goes a long way to protect you in that regard. So that data sets are not shared, outside of people who have access and so on. And there's just a protection and basically, I guess, just a respect for the information that's been shared.
Absolutely.
All right.
Very good. Thank you.
Any other general questions? We could get Avinash and Caroline up here too if there's anything you want to ask of them.
Yeah, go.
I guess I'm from the public health unit, so my question would be, is there enough of a sample size in the DHBs that you cover for the Auckland region?
So is there enough sample size, did you say?
Yeah. In the Auckland, like the ADHB, and you said counties, but not really much in Waitoa.
No, so there absolutely is in Auckland and in counties. That's absolutely right, because those were 2 of our recruitment DHBs. And the eligibility criteria for mums coming in was that they needed to be resident in those DHB areas as well as Waikato. So there were 3 contiguous DHB areas that defined that recruitment area. We wanted to include Waitemata in the original sampling, and we did have it in there for a start, but money and other constraints meant that we had to cut it down to 3. And the 3 out of the 4 we chose allowed us to have the ethnic and socioeconomic diversity that we required to generalise more widely, whereas Waitemata didn't give us that capacity. It's a bit of a shame, but that's the way it is. There will be some people who now live in that DHB, but you're right that the numbers are potentially small. So we could let you know where people were, and you could make a decision about whether that had enough numbers and therefore power to look at whatever question you were interested in. But the 3 key DHBs, you'll absolutely find enough capacity to look within those DHB areas if that's what you're keen to do. Yeah. Yep, go. All yours.
A couple of questions. The first one is about kind of the time frames in terms of like working through research questions, so obtaining it, and then actually in terms of getting the data. Any idea, or depending on the complexity of the question,
So if we start with, I'll start with the DAC process, and then maybe you can talk through the other half of it. So if you work through the process and fill in your DAC forms, your data access forms, whatever type they are. Those will come into our data access coordinator according to the data access email.
Yep.
At that point, they then have to go through sort of a review or a compliance check to check that everything has been filled in appropriately. So there's an admin process that goes on. That's usually just a day or two, depending on people's capacity and the number that come in at once. And then it goes through a data access process. Now, an internal process can be run electronically with a data access committee. They have 10 working days to review any application that comes their way, and then we will get back to our applicants within the next 10 working days. So you usually have a response within about 3 to 4 weeks from putting your application in. If it's an external form, sometimes that needs to go to a full data access committee meeting. They meet 5 times a year. So you may find that they're sort of every couple of months, say. So it just depends on the actual application form, and we have those dates available on the website as to when those meetings are occurring. So if you've got an external form, it makes sense to get them in sort of about a week or 10 days prior to a meeting, because then you know that they will be heard at the next meeting, and then you will hear within the next few days, actually. Then there's the process of you signing forms and things to say, I'm going to comply with this data access protocol, and that's sort of the step that follows that up. And then we usually aim to make data sets available within 21 working days. But, I mean, I don't know whether Pete and others, depends a little bit on the new e-research. We've still got to go through that UPI process.
So there's the onboarding process takes a week to 10 days at the moment. Just depends. If you've had a relationship with the university before and you already have a username, it's much quicker. If you're brand new to the system, it takes a little bit longer. And yeah, generally week to 10 days, all going well.
You get access for the particular research question, probably important to say as well. Yes. I don't think we've made that point, that anybody who has data access, internal or external, to the team gets access to address that research question and to provide usually an output, and they determine the time frame. If it gets towards the end of that time frame, you'll get a reminder from our data access coordinator, usually saying the time of access is coming to an end. You can apply for an extension, and that's perfectly fine if you're still working on the process. Otherwise, you'll find that, particularly with the electronic, the data access may end. But it's simple enough to just give yourself a few weeks to make sure that you extend that if you need to. But it is specific to a research question. You don't just get access to the data sets forever. And nobody does in the team either. It has to be every time there's a new research question, you have an application that goes through, and it's for that application. If your application changes, which it sometimes does, obviously, or you change investigators on that team, or you change universities, say, or institutions or agencies, depending where you are, then the expectation is that you come back to the data access coordinator and you make an amendment. Sometimes it's very simple and it's just an electronic process. If it's much more complex than that, if you've shifted countries or you've shifted your entire team, you may need to go through a data amendment, which might take a few weeks. So there's lots of processes all set out on the website, but it's all designed to help you to access the data safely, but also to make sure that we're protecting the integrity and the guardianship promises we've made to the participants. That's it.
Once you've done, sorry.
Yeah. Let's go back here and then we'll come here.
Going back to the data itself, it might be too early to tell because you said that retention is pretty good, but have you noticed any a differential attrition? Is it because you said it was powered to look at trajectories for ethnicities, or is there any evidence that might change?
There's definitely bias in the attrition, and we do describe that in the reports. And it's in the direction you'd expect. So the people that are absolutely opting out in that diagram that I showed you are more likely to be younger mums, are more likely to be more deprived, and they are more likely to be Māori and Pacific. However, given the size of the cohort and the absolute number of opt-outs, there is still adequate power, and it really doesn't make much difference to the proportions overall. So but it's a really important question, and it's really important to look at that in terms of skips and in terms of missingness, because every different research question will have a different proportion of missingness, and it's really important that whatever your question is, you look at who is missing, because there's absolutely likely to be bias in the group who are missing information about a particular characteristic, and unless you describe that, you're doing yourself and the cohort information a disservice. So, yeah, really good question.
Just as getting the agreement signed that I can have data access, can you just go over the responsibilities around the accountability of the storage of the data, like after you've done your analyses?
If you're accessing the data externally and you're on the e-research platform, all your data stays there. You can't take it off the system. So once your application has come to an end, we will remove all of that data off the system.
But you can apply, like Stats Lab,
yes,
to either have an extension, or you can apply to have your outputs vetoed.
That's exactly right.
In the same way that, so DAC again will look at, and the two overriding things that Data Access Committee look at are anonymity and sustainability.
Yes.
Anonymity, you've heard a lot about from Pete and others. Are we protecting the privacy of participants? So any small cell sizes, we will ask you to change.
Yep.
So it's not identifying groups less than 10, usually, is the rule we use. So the expectation is that you will change that to less than 10. So we're not identifying people in outputs. Okay, you'll be able to see them, but you won't be able to report those externally. The sustainability is a slightly different issue, and there's a kaitiaki principle that's involved in that. We do try, because there's a population study and we're looking at development and well-being, to not just have deficit approaches in the outcomes that are going to actually mean that our participants think, why am I contributing to this? So particularly where you're using ethnicity data and you're looking at Māori and Pacific, we want you to describe it in a way that is consistent with the way that data is being collected, and not use it as a sort of a weapon to say, one group is doing really badly and it's their fault, essentially. It's not a difficult rule to look at, but it's just important to be aware of. Again, it's set out in the documents. So the Data Access Committee are not looking to peer review your outputs. They don't do that. They are looking at whether you've protected anonymity and just making sure that basically this is in line with the context of the study and the way the questions were answered, so that we're protecting the sustainability of the study going forward. Not the funding necessarily, but the sustainability. Yeah.
Actually, that was a great segue into my question, which is about peer review, because I just thought, you could access the data, come to a completely erroneous conclusion. Is there scope for getting peer review, because that adds credibility to the conclusion, as in what you're saying anyway? So
it's a really good question. I think it's really sensible, as you say, to get peer review of any major piece of work that you're doing. That would be something we could offer you from the team if you wanted that. We could look at that as a separate process to the DAC process. Similarly, you could have somebody in mind that you would like to engage in that process, and we could discuss how that would work. It would need to be part of an output that had already had that sort of anonymity taken care of. But there would be absolutely ways to ensure that we could do that. We also have an expert scientific advisory group who are national and international experts that we could sort of co-opt into that role should that be required, and I'm sure they would be happy to engage in some of those processes. In fact, they have for us internally. So
how do you stop groups going rogue?
So we basically, the e-research platform is actually a step forward in that. So previously, as many other longitudinal studies have done and other data sets that have been made available, were made available through Dropboxes, or made available even before that on floppy disks and things, which is kind of like, and sent through the mail. We've all heard about those stories, right? Yeah. So the e-research platform is actually a way to try and prevent that. So we can monitor who is accessing that closed system. It should match with the IDs who have been given access. And we can, in the extreme cases, we can curtail access should we become aware of a breach. And it's much easier to do through that process than actually is right now, where if people choose to share data sets even though they've signed their lives away saying they won't, and then we find out, then we have to have a discussion and remove access, and that's much harder. So actually the way that we're moving ahead with this process, I think, is a step up in terms of safety and security. Yep. That said, I think it's fair to say that people do value this data. They do respect the agreements that they've made, and we're not actually aware of any breaches at this stage. And if we were, we would deal with them reasonably quickly internally. And That's sort of where the process is at.
Yeah, there's a, I mean, so you've accessed the data, you've used the research platform, you're ready to now share your output with the wider community or people you work with. So that kicks off a whole output process checking sort of phase. You let us know, we'll have a look at it. It'll go through our DAC, and you know, so you've got that check in place. Whereas previously, yeah, you wouldn't be able to.
I think there is another advantage of the e-research platform which Pete didn't mention, and he compared it to the statistics data lab, which is very true. They occur at fixed geographical spaces. This is actually, you can log into this virtually anywhere. So it is actually quite an advanced system in this capacity. As long as you're still using the closed system, you can actually access it through any internet connection once you have that access set up. So you're not restricted to being in certain different environments, but we can see where you are. I can't. He can.
Get off.
No, it's not.
Just saying.
Just saying, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a good point, Susan.
Any other?
Yes.
Yeah. Then we'll go back. Yeah.
I just wanted to acknowledge your study. I moved over from Europe, Sweden, Europe 2.5, 3 years ago, and my then current manager said, "Oh, they got this really awesome longitudinal study going on." Well, maybe the Dunedin study, but he was talking about growing up in New Zealand because he'd heard about it. And I thought, that's a really cool one. So it's known overseas as well.
Good job. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
It's very kind. Yeah. And we're very happy for international people to be working either alongside you or to actually be utilising this. We already do some work with international comparisons. I think there's a great deal to be said about comparing our own cohort in their context with similar cohorts overseas, and again that's all about protecting the anonymity of each of those cohorts because they all have those sort of processes. There's a lot you can do by harmonising the analyses, and it's actually really exciting. So we do that as well, so if people are interested in that sort of space, absolutely come and talk to us about what's possible with, particularly with Australia and with Europe and the UK. There are lots of other cohort studies going on that are very like Growing Up in New Zealand. Some of them are called Growing Up in such and such. It's not a mistake, it's not by accident. We don't ask the same questions, but we have the capacity still nevertheless to often look across and compare. Yep.
If anybody is interested, Lava, Richard and I are working on two projects that are looking at growing up in Australia and growing up in New Zealand, comparing those on the childhood obesity question.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Yeah, good. It's really useful actually because you get around the cohort effect and you can start looking at the societal and political context in each of those different countries and understanding how those have potentially impacted on the trajectory. So it's a really nice way to do things. Yes, sorry, we were coming back to you. I beg your pardon.
I was trying to clarify, it doesn't sound like there's a kind of public good requirement or sharing research, like you get stats in data, is that right? Or can you kind of just do it and then not necessarily share it beyond your organisation?
You mean in terms of what you do with your output?
Yeah.
I think the expectation in general is that the analyses you do are designed to create an output that either has scientific, policy or both applications. So we do encourage people to work through a process that will then release a document, whether it's a report or whether it's a paper, that can be seen in the public domain. So it's some people will get through their analyses and decide that's not where they want to go, and that doesn't prohibit you using the data sets. But I do think that overall what we're seeking to do with all of these processes, whether they're internal, accredited or external, is actually get people engaged in the data sets and then share those results. Is that?
Yeah, it does. Do you have kind of a collection point for where it's done externally? Because I know that you've got your own reports on your website, but to see how other people are using it, is there a way you can easily find out?
So at the moment you can see what applications have been approved on the website. So again, through that green portal, it's quite a few clicks down. So and we said this morning we're trying to actually improve that sort of visibility of that. But every data access application that has been approved, whether it's internal, external or accredited, is listed there. So you can see what projects are currently happening. And then we're linking those to the outputs wherever we can as well. That's easier with internal work because obviously we can see where that is. We're also encouraging people externally to share those outputs with us so that there is a central repository. It's also a really good way to measure utility, value and impact. So we have internal statistics that we use a lot about how is this data set being used, how many publications has it led to. So for example, internally we know we now have over 100 publications from the first 4 years, and we have hundreds of policy relevant outputs, and those are all listed. So, but what we're trying to do is set up a process for external users to show the same sort of impact, if you like, and to demonstrate then the utility of this and how it's being used widely. So those are really important stats, and one of our projects at the moment that Pete and others are leading is just looking at innovative ways to try and make that easier. So more electronic. We're looking at ways to try and track applications and track outputs from beginning to end, a bit like you would see a flow chart across an HRC application, for example, where you can see where your application is sitting, see where you're at in terms of access, and then when you've finished you can see what you need to do, so that we're trying to automate it rather than do it manually, which is what we've been doing to date, and it's kind of getting a little bit difficult to manage, which is great because that's the problem we want to have, right?
Yes, it's a good problem to have.
Yeah, but watch this space over the next few months, because hopefully that will get easier for everybody to see. It doesn't change the actual process, but it will become more visible, I think. Anything else? Yes, go again.
Absolutely.
Go on.
I just wondering, because you guys are obviously quite familiar with data and stuff, is there anything that you think would be just really awesome to look into? What would be like one of those research questions at overlook, or what's
That's a good question. That's a very good question.
That's a really, really good question, and there's so much.
So many.
What we're doing right now is trying to collate those, actually, and in the next 2 to 3 months, certainly this side of Christmas, we are hoping to put up a list of potential projects, whether those are for PhDs, whether they're for masters, whether they're potential external projects. You know, they can be up for grabs. So we're trying to help you with that. There's a lot. So I think absolutely, if you think of a question that is about some of the richness of the data you've seen, it's likely that that question is available. If you want to see examples of what we currently, or what teams are currently looking at, whether it's internal or external, you can see that on the website so far. But I think we're trying to provide more and more helpful hints, if you like, about what could you look at with this. I mean, I guess if I had to name one, and then we'll hand over and let someone else name one, then I would say that the ECE space is ripe for someone to come in and actually really do a really good set of analyses on the audit of ECE interaction of these children. It's a very big project. It's not something you can do on the side or that people have got time to look at, but actually sorting out all of that information and tracking the journeys of these children through ECE, and then potentially finding out what that means for school readiness and school performance, I think, is one that I would put out there as probably a PhD project or a big postdoc. Yeah. Anyway, that's just one. I don't know if anyone else has any suggestions. There are probably heaps of nutrition. We've measured nutrition, food frequency questionnaires at virtually every time we've seen the children. It's a huge lot of data that needs, someone to get their head in. This is where partnership approaches or accredited researchers can be really valuable. External can work too, but sometimes there's a win-win in terms of sharing expertise, people coming with specific expertise who might want to work alongside the team and actually develop some of these projects. We have 12 PhD students at the moment, I think, and they're doing amazing work because actually those students, as well as some of the partnership project, I'm looking at you, Steve, at the moment in terms of Ministry of Education, having people who are funded to come and work alongside the team and to actually really explore an area is what actually uses the data better, because we are tied up quite a lot in just the day-to-day activities of keeping this data set on board, collecting it and keeping it out there for you to use as well as for our own team. So.